Hey everybody, welcome to the 2020 Global Shifts Colloquium of Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Policy Hub, for our keynote conversation with the Honorable Chuck Hagel. Thank you all for being here today. We're excited to be conducting our first ever virtual colloquium and thrilled that so many of you have tuned in from around the world. And I hope that everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. My name is Michael Horowitz, a Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry Worldhouse. I'll do my formal introduction of our keynotes in a moment. But before I begin, a few logistical notes. One, following the keynote remarks and conversation, we'll open the discussion up to the questions that have been received from the audience. Two, to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle. Three, you will also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for any technical or other logistical issues. And finally, fourth, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and the Q&A, which will help us have a successful event. And we are honored to have two distinguished guests with us for an interesting conversation as part of the Global Shifts Colloquium today, looking at the national security impact of climate change with the Honorable Chuck Hagel and CNN national security analyst, and more important from our perspective, Penn alum Sam Vinograd. Chuck Hagel was the 24th Secretary of Defense, serving from February 2013 to February 2015. He's the only Vietnam veteran and the first enlisted combat veteran to serve as Secretary of Defense. Prior to his leadership at the Pentagon, he served 2 terms in the United States Senate, representing the state of Nebraska. We're also excited that Secretary Hagel will be joining us as a visiting fellow, engaging with Penn students and faculty throughout the year. Turning to today's conversation, Secretary Hagel is foregrounded preparing for climate change throughout his career in both the Senate and the Department of Defense. He was a founding member of the American Security Project, an organization that has led research into the national security impact of climate change. He led a Senate delegation to the Kyoto negotiations and the effort to require a national intelligence assessment of the security impacts of climate change. And as Secretary of Defense, he issued the department's first Arctic strategy in 2013, highlighting how the military would respond to melting ice and other challenges, as well as the department's first climate adaptation roadmap, detailing how to prepare for climate change and how worsening extreme weather might impact the country's military readiness. Drawing on Secretary Hagel's testimony from that hearing, his work has been informed by US scientists telling us that a melting Arctic, more frequent droughts and floods, and extreme weather are all examples of the changing climate in the United States and around the world. He has stated that climate change is threatening our economy, the environment, and our national security. Changing weather patterns threaten our national security through its impacts on military infrastructure, disaster response, and the economy. The impacts of climate change are clearly evidenced today, as Secretary Hagel has said. He'll be in conversation with Samantha Vinograd, a CNN national security analyst, a senior advisor at the Biden Institute, and the co-founder of Global Opportunity Advisors. She began her career under President Bush as the Deputy US Treasury Attaché to Iraq, and subsequently served on President Obama's National Security Council as Director for Iraq, Director for International Economics, and Senior Advisor to the National Security Advisor. She also has a weekly column on CNN.com that I highly recommend checking out. She received her MA from some school called Georgetown that nobody's ever heard of, and more important, her BA from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome back, Sam, and we look forward to your conversation with Secretary Hagel. The floor is all yours.
Michael, thank you so much for having me, and it is great to virtually be back at my alma mater, UPenn. Studying at Penn really launched my career in government service. I started studying the Middle East as a young 18-year-old, and it really provided the foundation for my career in public service. I am thrilled to be back here with you, Mr. Secretary. We spent more hours than I can count in the windowless Situation Room discussing all kinds of threats to US national security. So it's good to virtually see you in some daylight for a change. And I honestly can't think of a more opportune time for us to be discussing climate change. We're watching parts of our country burn as we speak. We're tracking extreme weather events like hurricanes approaching the homeland. And it is key that climate change is having immediate impacts on Americans all over the country. What I thought we'd do today is start big picture and then drill down into some more of the specifics about the threat that climate change poses, how this administration is handling the threat of climate change, and where do we go from here. So to kick things off, let's start at the 50,000 feet level. You have written and spoken so much about climate change. From a defense perspective, why does addressing climate change matter? Mr. Secretary, I think you may be on mute.
Oh, I see. Okay.
There we go. Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm at the junior high level.
I think you're doing great. The mute button is a tough one on Zoom.
Expertise, but well, first I want to thank Michael from the Perry World House for inviting me and this session today, because I think the topic and what you both said so far is critical to our future and to our children's future, to the future of the world. Sam, good to see you again. I see you on CNN often, but you're right. We spend a little time together when there weren't any windows to talk about big things. So it's really a privilege to be back with you and share some thoughts today, and look forward to our discussion and the questions that will come here a little later. I think there's so much, as we all know, involved in this issue of climate change and its effect on everything. But for me, it's always been about the consequences of climate change as to how it relates to global stability. Because when the world is destabilized, when your country is, a community is, bad things happen. And there's nothing that you can do when a hurricane hits, or wildfires, or whatever that consequence of what we know is happening in the changing of our climate. What you can do, though, is prepare, is try to get ahead of it and do everything you can to minimize what causes these weather patterns and these melting of the Arctic ice and the changing of our temperatures, the carbon emissions. And that's kind of where I start, with understanding the real world of when you destabilize, that climate change is doing today. We look at California, we've got another hurricane headed to the Gulf Coast. We're in hurricane season again in Florida and the East Coast. Then you know there'll be economic consequences. You know there'll be political consequences. There'll be governing consequences. Also, security consequences. When you are looking at the possibility of bases underwater, or putting bases out of commission, that directly reflects on our ability to secure this country, defend this country. And then as you move that around the world, what you see is a magnification of all of that intensity that comes from that instability. So Sam, that's the way I've always approached it, and then worked from there, whether I was in the Senate or Secretary of Defense, or when I co-chaired the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. I mean, that's where you can start to do something about it. Do something about it now, until it's too late. And it will be too late if we don't accelerate our efforts on this issue.
I couldn't agree more. And I remember the role that intelligence, not just science, but the role that intelligence played in our preparedness for climate change, and seeing assessments on how other countries were responding to the risk posed by climate change as part of our intelligence briefings, as part of our open source reporting, as we thought about global instability, as we thought about resource decisions. And you have written about and spoken about the risk of actual state failure because of climate change. Can you spin out for us a little bit how currently fragile states may or may not be more exposed to the risks posed by climate change? And do you think that climate change could actually lead to a state fracturing, failing?
Well, I do think that that's a possibility of a failed, fractured state, or a government coming apart, and all the attending consequences that flow from that. As we were just saying, when you undermine an economy, when you undermine how people make a living, how they depend on that, how a government depends on that, not just for the resources, but for the state of governing, all the institutions that are charged with governing, whether the local, state, national. And when you've got instability and you've got chaos and you've got people with no homes, nowhere to go, nothing to eat, medical issues, overburdening your entire medical system, then that's prescription for complete chaos. That's a breakdown in a system. And there's not a lot you can do about that. It's just the way it is. And for governments that are fragile now, as you mentioned, it's even more intense, that threat. Even strong governments have a problem with this, but fragile governments that are right on the edge, they can't survive. They won't survive because essentially revolution takes place. I mean, when your family has nothing and has nothing to eat, nowhere to go, no medical attention, no help from anybody, you've got lawlessness. Then everything that flows from that, and governments can't control it. There aren't enough police. You can't put the military on enough on the streets to change it. And remember that policemen and military men and women also are human beings, also with families, also will lose their homes and everything that they have. So they're not just a robotic part of all of this. They're part of the human dimension of this. And it comes back down to the humanity of all of this. And you just overwhelm governments, and governments just can't deal with it. Now that's a worst case scenario, I know that, but I think we've got to think ahead, and I think we've got a plan for a possibility of those kinds of things happening in the world. The world today is so fragile. I don't think we've seen a time since World War II when the world is so volatile and so unpredictable and so uncertain. We're seeing a dangerous erosion of alliances and those institutions that were built after World War II, a world order. And the more those institutions erode, the least effective then the world can be as a world effort to deal with these things. So I'll stop there because I've touched on a lot of parts to this.
And I want to dive into all of them. And on your point about fractured alliances, later in the conversation, we'll get to the Paris Climate Accord. Separate from the Paris Climate Accord, I am deeply aware, as are likely many members of our audience, just the retrenchment from alliances and from international institutions and agreements more broadly that we've seen these last 4 years, whether it's the WHO, various strains on NATO, and other alliances as well all over the world, and again, institutional bodies. But it is hard to imagine how the United States can play a constructive role in a coordinated response to climate change as President Trump denies its impacts, and as we are no longer a party, a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord in just a few weeks that goes into effect. But let's talk about planning. I remember during my time under President Bush and under President Obama that we looked at both short-term threats and longer-term threats. Climate change poses both. Currently, we're seeing resources deployed to mitigate natural disasters, but hopefully somebody is doing some longer-term planning and doing the kind of scenario outlook that you just described, which includes, unfortunately, potential state failure. From a defense perspective, what does it look like? How do you prepare and respond to the threats that climate change poses, both from a near-term and a longer-term perspective, or how did you, I should say?
Yeah. From the defense perspective, you first inventory all of your bases around the world, all of the locations where your platforms are located, whether it's ports, whether it's an Air Force base, Army, Marines, wherever. and you reassess and review those locations, their vulnerability, what you have to do to change that vulnerability. Obviously, our Navy is where water is, and so you're not going to get away from that. But then you look at fortifying the structures, and you look at the possibilities of what comes: typhoons, hurricanes, that sea levels that will change all that. Hurricanes sometimes are preludes to tornadoes, and so you try to assess all the locations, what you can do to prepare those locations, or in some cases maybe move those locations to stronger, better locations that can weather the potential of what's coming. That factors in also the technology that goes into all of this, and where that technology is, and how you can incorporate it. Also, that's a budget planning issue too, because that's money usually over the last 50 years, 20 years, that we really didn't plan for in budgets. And that has to be in coordination, conjunction with the Congress, because the Congress appropriates the money. And so they've got to be on board on this. So there's a lot of conversations that have to take place, not only within the defense community, but within the political governing community in Congress, is obviously, as well as the White House. So I think those are places that you start. And then as you broaden out that picture, then you pick all the individual things that will come as a result and the consequence of those kind of reviews and that kind of planning and that kind of new resource implementation that's going to be required to fortify those bases. And by the way, this is around the world, as you know, Sam. Our defenses is not located here, but our forward power projection is based on so much of those locations around the world, and so many of them are located near water. Mm-hmm. And we know that sea rises are coming; they have been coming, and then that further complicates it with dealing with the host government on what they're willing to do to help, and so they've got to be on board as well. So that's would be the beginning.
And the rising water impacting installations along coastlines all around the world is a major threat, as are rising temperatures. I would imagine that in various theaters, as temperatures reach dangerous levels, that actually physically impacts our troops, what they can carry and what they're able to do. That's
right. The temperatures have an effect, no question. Middle East, where we have troops. Africa, AFRICOM, Central Command. Those are the obvious ones, and where you have those high temperatures in Africa and the Middle East. But so too, you're seeing it in Asia. I mean, we have large troop contingents, as you know, in South Korea and Japan, for example. So yes, it's not just related to our bases and areas where those bases, those ports, those airstrips are near water, but sure, temperature and all that goes with high temperatures we have to deal with as well.
Yes, and I would imagine that water scarcity impacts force deployments as well, as that becomes increasingly scarce in key theaters, which, as you mentioned, AFRICOM, CENTCOM, and elsewhere. I do know that in addition to planning to mitigate the risks of climate change on our ability to deploy force where necessary and to be prepared, when President Obama was in office, the military itself actually made investments in more energy efficient technologies, whether it was the green fleet and otherwise. How much time did you spend, or should the next Secretary of Defense spend, whoever that may be, in thinking about how to lower the carbon footprint, for example, of our military forces in general?
Well, I can't speak for my predecessors or successors. I mean, I generally have some idea, but I can give you the most articulate answer, if I'm capable of that, from my own experience. And as was noted in my introduction, I introduced the first Arctic defense strategy. And I think you were in the White House at that time. And that was in November 2013 up in Nova Scotia. And it was a strategy that actually written down and thought through. And the first time that that had been done in the Pentagon about how we were going to deal with this issue, this challenge, this reality of what we're facing in the future of climate change. And we focused to begin with in what I introduced in that speech, and then we followed up. We had handouts, but we had 100-page strategy books. We focused on the Arctic for obvious reasons. And by the way, we're way behind in the Arctic. I mean, that's another issue, but way behind. And we focused on that because that seemed to us to be the most immediate concern that we would have to deal with. But so too, we talked about the rest of the globe and the rest of our facilities. So as we were thinking through this, and I started thinking about it more and more, and I suppose the reason I did as much as anything else is because I had some experience in the last 12 years in the Senate, as I was the leader of the Senate Climate Change Group and led the delegations in Kyoto and all the subsequent Kyoto meetings in Buenos Aires and the Netherlands. So and then my intelligence background, I've been on the intelligence committees and so on. So I probably had maybe a little more grounding in that area than some. Also, my predecessors were absorbed, as you know so well, with the Middle East. I mean, terrorism. After September 11th, 2001, I mean, that was the focus of our country, the threat of terrorism. So Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East, that part of the world got the attention. And we didn't pay attention to our nuclear facilities, and that was another issue. But we kind of let everything else slide. And I'm not being critical by saying that. I mean, that happens. So I think I was kind of in a unique position and maybe lucky because I did have that background. I could spend some time on it, and I did spend some time on it. I suppose my successors also spent some time on it because as every year went by, the evident challenge and concern became more and more obvious of what climate change, changing of temperatures, rising of the seas, and all the consequences that come with that, temperatures, was going to do to our security apparatus. So that's the way I came at it, and probably a little bit as to why I spent time on it.
And before we get to some of the domestic issues that you laid out, particularly Congress and the role of the executive branch, when you were working on these issues as Secretary of Defense, how did you find we measured up vis-a-vis other militaries or other governments? Was this sense of urgency that you felt shared by your peers at the time?
I don't think so. I think, and I say this not to be critical of them, I think they had even more issues and challenges than we did in many ways. First of all, none of our allies had an economy anywhere near the strength of the United States. And our large economy gave Defense Department, even though, as you remember, when I took over as Secretary of Defense, 1 week after I took over, sequestration started.
I remember that well, yes.
You do, of course. That meant that I had to find another $50 billion in cuts for the next 11 months we had not planned for. We didn't know how we were going to get it. We had to close things, and you know the story. Well, these other governments, even though we had to go through that, just didn't have the resources, and still don't, that we have. That's number one. I think no country has the responsibility that the United States has in our alliances, our allies, our relationships around the world. And so they're not near as troubled as we are, of course, in the sense of the larger context of climate change, because they just don't have the bases. They don't have the responsibilities. They don't have the facilities like we have. I think third, many of our allies are more inward. I mean, in Europe and so on. And Europe, no continent has been spared, as we know. And but I think Europe, if you take a look at all comparing what's happened around the world, probably Europe has gotten off a little easier than a lot of other areas, but they still been touched. So, and then having to deal with what they had to deal with, as we were dealing with, and the issue of terrorism, because we know what's happened in Europe the last few years, and they don't have the force structure that we do. So the leaders of Europe and all our allies around the world in Asia have been dealing with a lot of their own problems, still at the same time trying to address climate change. But because we are so rich and so powerful and so fortunate to have the technologies that we have and everything that we have, no other country is fortunate as we are. And so I think that's also a part of it, that they deal with other problems more immediate, not so much in the long term, but they're dealing with immediate. But at the same time, I would give the Europeans credit and the Asians for leading this climate change. I mean, quite frankly, the United States wasn't a leader on climate change. And it was other nations who were leading. And they didn't have the resources, but they saw it coming. And I'll end with this. I think because we're a young country, relatively speaking, when you look at so many nations and areas of the world, we're kind of still a little baby, 250 years old. And I think older cultures and older nations tend to look past the present more. I think they tend to look into the future more. And also because we've never had anywhere near a world war or a violent war other than the Civil War on our land, in our country. We've been very blessed by that, mainly to start with because we've had these two vast oceans that have protected our east and west coast. So I think other nations tend to look into the future more sometimes than we do. I mean, we're a fast pace, let's go get it done. And there's a great advantage to that too. I mean, it's produced a pretty successful culture and society and nation. But I think we tend not to look down into the future enough because what could come up that we can't handle. We'll have a technology for it. We're smarter than, we're richer than anybody, and so we can handle it. Other countries don't take that same approach. I think we're becoming wiser about that on how we look, because we're being forced now to look into the future a lot more than I think we ever did.
And do you think that explains, or partially explains, the role that China has played in climate change negotiations? I remember being at the National Security Council while the Paris Climate Accords are being negotiated, and China back then, just as it does now, it was and is a rival power. China is certainly not known for its focus on the environment, but China did sign the Paris Climate Accords. China is still a party to the Paris Climate Accords, and China has made investments in renewables while continuing to still burn a lot of coal, among other things. Why do you think China made a strategic decision to get on board trying to mitigate the impact of climate change? Is it that longer term outlook that the Chinese Communist Party is able to have?
Well, of course, I don't know, but I've dealt with the Chinese since 1983, when I first went to China as a businessman. I had two partners. We started a company in the cellular telephone business. In 1983, nobody knew what the hell cellular telephones were. When you say cellular, people would think it's a medical term or something. And I remember we started an international company, and I took a couple of Motorola technicians with me, because in those days, Motorola was the only one that had a cellular telephone, and some people still might remember the first cellular telephone. It was the size.
They were very big, yes.
Yeah, like a brick. So we went to China for 10 days. Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, different places, then Canton. And I remember walking out of a presentation that I had made to some government communications people and engineers that were in the room about what this technology is and why is it so good and why is it going to change the future, this technology, even though I can't push the unmute button. But I had smart engineers that knew how to do that. I remember walking out of that meeting, and one of the older Chinese engineers walked me out, and he said, "Mr. Hagel, that was a very interesting presentation. But he said, you should remember, China is a culture of 5,000 years. We are very patient, and we're always patient with everything. And we pick and choose when we want to do things and decide to do things. And it may be 100 years or 50 years. I've never forgotten that conversation. And I've applied that to every time I meet with, when I met with Xi, I think 3 times in 2014 when I was Secretary of Defense. I've always remembered that. So to your question about China, I think, first of all, I think China recognized early on that climate change and the effects of climate change were going to directly impact them. They also understood they had the reality of 1.3 billion people, the reality of having to use coal to fuel their economy and to keep people warm, just the reality of survival. And they knew they were going to continue to have to use coal for quite a while until nuclear would come online, natural gas, renewables. So I think, and last point I would make as to why, and they got out ahead in many ways and signed so many of these agreements. I think they did it also for diplomatic reasons. I think they understood that this was a smart way for the rest of the world to view them as an emerging power, a new entrant into the world order, wanting to be a responsible new entrant into the world order. And this was a smart diplomatic thing to do, would be to cooperate with the world on these economic measures and these agreements. So I think all those things led to China's, in many ways, preeminence in this area of dealing with climate change and technology and what they're doing in so many of the areas. In the year 2000, no, it was 1997. 1997, I got to Kyoto, Japan, early, before the conference started. And the late former Senator John Chafee from Rhode Island, who was a World War II veteran, had served in China during World War II, tremendous guy, and former governor of Rhode Island. And so he got there early as well, because he was way ahead of everybody else on climate. And so we were talking, and I said, well, let's see if we can get a military plane to take us into China. And he wanted to look at the Three Gorges Dam that was being built in Sichuan province around the major city Chengdu. And I was interested in that too. So we were able to get a little military plane to take us into China. It was interesting because on that trip, that was the first military plane that China allowed to take anybody in that far into China. And Chengdu's pretty far into China. We went to Chengdu for 2 days and 2 nights. And what we saw in 1997 was amazing what they were doing addressing climate change. And all the technologies that we had never heard of, what they were involved in. But the way that they were living, the people in Chengdu, they weren't burning coal, by the way. They had other fuels, alternative fuels. But it was really a green place. I mean, it was really a green place. And John Chafee and I were stunned by it. And I told John Kerry came in early too, because John has been very involved in climate change, a leader on climate change for many, many years. So I remember having dinner, John Chafee and John Kerry and I, one of the nights we got back, to tell John Kerry about what we had seen. So I use that as a personal anecdote to just reference the leadership that China has shown in this area. But I think bottom line as to why, I think clearly they saw it as very much in their interest.
And the long-term health and security of their country, which is something that we used to do. We used to do that long-term planning. Now it feels to a certain extent that certain people can't see much beyond their next tweet, when in fact, the actions that are happening right now will have implications for generations to come. And I want to turn in our last 10 or 15 minutes or so before we open it up to audience questions. And just a reminder to everyone to send your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll get to them. I want to turn to what's happening, or I should say what's not happening on certain fronts domestically. This president claims to be the biggest supporter of the military yet he denies the impacts of climate change. At the RNC, I don't think that the phrase climate change came up once. It was a big pillar of the DNC's key messages. How can the president say that he cares about the military and that he cares about the homeland when he denies climate change? How is that possible?
Well, I don't think it is possible. But I don't understand. First of all, I don't understand where President Trump comes from on a lot of things. But I don't understand the logic of denying this. I mean, when it's so obvious to everyone that something's happening, and there's a reason for it. And yes, we don't have 100% all the answers and all the certainty, but we have enough. We have enough from the climate scientists and from records and what's going on. We've got enough. And your point about saying that you care more about the military than any president, and you've done more for the military than any president, and not recognize the threat of climate change is a gross contradiction. And you can't defend it. I mean, I heard his remarks in California, I guess yesterday, when he said it was just a lot of leaves on the ground, just a natural burning of too many leaves from too many years. And so it's dry, and this is what happens. I mean, to explain the president of the United States, explain what's happening in California that way, really tells me that he really doesn't have any understanding of any of this. And more to the point, and to your question, I think, doesn't really understand or is not concerned about the consequences of this. not just for the military and for the men and women in the military, but for the country, for what's going on in California and Oregon. Other states have gone through it, but California over the years, last 2 and 3 years, has been inundated. And to cavalierly dismiss it by there's no such thing as climate change is, in my opinion, pretty irresponsible.
And he, in my opinion, he doesn't just deny climate change, he's taken certain steps to exacerbate it by rolling back various regulations that dangerously increase emissions. And to our conversation earlier, failing to take steps to mitigate the effects for future generations. Perhaps he thinks that, you know, it isn't his problem. As again, parts of the country are burning, Democratic states, which he's threatened to cut funding to before. But this is not the only example when he's claimed to deny science, whether it's COVID-19, and we now know that he did understand the impact. So on climate change, I don't know if he doesn't understand it or he just doesn't want to acknowledge it based on other priorities that he has. But what I can't quite figure out is, I'm sitting here, I'm talking to you, you were just regaling us with your stories about a bipartisan conversation you had in 1997 with John Kerry and others. This used to be a bipartisan conversation. This used to be a conversation that Republicans and Democrats agreed on because they cared about the near-term security of the homeland and they cared about their children and grandchildren's health and stability. Do you find that Congress, Republicans in Congress currently, governors, Republican governors, are they less willing to speak up? Are they taking actions behind the scenes? This appears to be, and this is not a rhetorical question, but this appears to have become more of a Democrat issue than a Republican one. Do I have that right or wrong?
No, I do think you have it right. And a Democrat issue more than a Republican issue. It didn't start with President Trump's administration or the Republicans over the last few years. Back in 1997, the reason that I was chairman of the climate change Senate group was because Republicans were in charge of the Senate. Now, if Democrats would have been in charge of the Senate, John Kerry probably would have been chairman. Also, it wasn't my particularly important or wide and deep background in climate change. I happened to be the subcommittee chairman on the Foreign Relations Committee of the subcommittee that had jurisdiction over this issue. So I mean, it was just, for me, it was just fortuitous. It was lucky that I was there and I was interested in the issue too. So there were differences back in the 90s. Between Republicans and Democrats, not is it real so much. I mean, there were some Republicans who said, no, this is not real. It's phony. It's just a political issue. Some Republicans, just like today, but more Republicans, from what I can see, are saying that today, at least in elected office, than said that when I was in the Senate in the 90s and up until 2009. But the difference is, Sam, when I was in the Senate, you know, there was nothing particular that we were more virtuous than anybody else or more honest or any of that. But the difference was that we actually worked together and we tried to compromise. We tried to understand each other. We listened to each other. We actually socialized with each other. Having dinner with an evil Democrat. No, you shouldn't do that. I mean, you co-sponsored legislation. You had differences, but you worked them out. That's the big difference. And on climate change, there was a difference. The big difference in the Kyoto Protocol for Republicans and Democrats, Republicans mostly were opposed to it, the Kyoto Protocol, because it didn't include China and Russia and most of the countries of the world, all the large emitters other than the United States. So it put, the feeling was too much burden on us. I mean, how can you fix and deal with climate change if you don't have Russia in and China in and all the rest of them? So that was the real sticking point between Republicans and Democrats on climate change. It wasn't so much that most Republicans didn't think it was true. Some did, that's true. But that, like I said, the difference was how we dealt with it and how we learned from each other and how we listened to each other. And we had hearings on this, and different people would make their point of view. And that's pretty much gone now. We've seen an administration that doesn't foster that, that penalizes its own party members for compromising. It's almost like a religion now. I'm absolutely right all the time. You're absolutely wrong all the time. I don't have any time for you. And when you get that approach to democracy, you're headed for a lot of trouble, because there's only one alternative to that, and that's authoritarian government. Let one person make all the decisions.
Unfortunately, that hits quite close to home these days. As you know, I started my career under a Republican. I ended my government service under a Democrat, but we did used to have conversations, differences of opinion on how to address problems, and you weren't shooed out of the room if you expressed a dissenting view. But you know, to go one step further, you wrote in the Scientific American last year, I believe, that the government is actually suppressing science. And ostensibly to adhere to messages that the government, the executive branch feels more comfortable putting out perhaps for political reasons. We've withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord. All of this feels like, based upon what you've described, as other countries march ahead with addressing climate change, are walking away from this fight will put us further behind, just from a kind of a global stability, global competition standpoint. Do you agree with that assessment? Are we falling behind other countries security-wise if we fail to take rapid action?
I do believe that. And I think, especially the last 4 years, with this administration's complete denial of climate change, and then that penetrating down through the institutions, the governing institutions in our government. You mentioned science, what I said about in that piece I wrote in Scientific Review. Yeah, we're seeing it with COVID-19. Dismiss the medical experts, dismiss the scientists if they don't fit into our political opinion or our political view or our political lexicon. Dismiss it. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, you can't dismiss science. I mean, I understand that science, as you develop theories and deal with vaccines, for example, science is imperfect as it starts, as it works its way toward some perfection, like a vaccine. But you should never ever dismiss science, even in its rawest form. And there's been enough science out there for enough years that we've lived through this. I mean, just temperature readings and every very relevant indicator of something going on. And so I think this administration has suppressed science, and I think has penalized science, and I think has driven a lot of good people out of government, and especially young people. That we want bright young people coming into government who are scientists, who are in these fields that we need for the future of the country, for the strength of our country, for the betterment of our country. And we don't want to discourage them. And unfortunately, I think too much of my own party, my own Republican Party, has gone along with this, has enabled it. And I don't know if that's a result of not having the political courage to take on a president. I know that's tough to take on a president. I challenged my own party president on Iraq, George Bush. I mean, I was vilified and said I was a traitor and I was a rhino and Republican in name only and so on and so on. But, you know, you got to have the courage to understand the responsibilities of your job. And your job is not to put your political party ahead of the country or to put a president ahead of the country. It's do what you think is right for the country. And I think this is one of those issues that we're seeing a test here in many ways.
I hope that for anybody listening, that message reverberates, because it's true. The oath of office is to the country, to protect the country, not to serve a particular president. And I'm going to ask you one more question, sir, and then we're going to go to audience questions. And this isn't an easy one. I saved the best for last, but with 4 years of not just inaction on climate change, but 4 years of assailing the environment and really moving us backward from a climate change perspective, is it possible for us to recover? And what would that look like in your opinion?
Well, I'm going to give you my optimistic answer, but it's also, yes, I'm an optimist, and I always have been. I think it's just, if nothing else, easier to get up in the morning and be an optimist other than going through the day living a Greek tragedy. I mean, it's just a better way to exist.
I'm an optimist too, so we have that in common.
But I'm also a realist. I'm very much a realist. And yes, I don't think it's too late for this country. I think that we have the resources, the people, the technology, the wealth, the capability. We've got everything. So much more than other countries. And that doesn't mean we're better people than anybody else. But we're blessed with so much of that, because so many people, our generations before us, have worked hard to hand something to us, and each subsequent generation is build on that. And so it's not too late, but it will be too late. And here I venture into politics. I mean, we've been talking politics a little bit, and this is not meant to be a campaign speech, but I've got to be honest in answering your question. We will be too late if we have more of the same mentality that's in charge of our government over the next few years. Then we will not be able to catch up. We just won't. We'll be too far behind. I mean, we're gonna end this year with a deficit of over $3 trillion. We end last year with a deficit of about $1 trillion. And everybody said, oh my God, I mean, this is unbelievable. Well, people have got to understand all that adds up. Well, I take the deficit and the debt in our country as one example of why you can't catch up. Because if you get so far behind in these things, that the overpowering cost of everything and paying down that debt, and how much of the tax base, the GDP is going to have to, in our government spending, is going to have to go to pay interest on our national debt. And with our entitlement programs, our debt, and so on, we won't have the funds to keep the strong national defense and do all the other things that we're trying to do in this country, and then add billions and billions more on to trying to catch up scientifically with climate change. Now, I mean, the reality is nature doesn't wait for anybody. And remember that old commercial on television, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature? That should be as cogent a warning as anything.
I couldn't agree more. So let's hope that there is a sea change, and that there is a market focus on mitigating the impacts of climate change going forward, starting soon. We're going to go to audience questions, sir, and we have a lot of them that have come in. One of them, the first one that I'll turn to, it has to do with current conflicts intersection with climate change. Could you further discuss the role of climate change in exacerbating conflict and instability in key theaters like the Middle East and Africa?
Yes. Well, again, I'll start where I began conversation about instability. When you look at the Middle East today, you have countries, and you know this so well, Sam, that have no functioning governments. Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, I mean, doesn't even have a government. Iraq's in trouble. And you can go around some of those other, Libya, other areas, they're all troubled. They've all got problems. So when you start there, and you've got instability in the countries and in the region, and you've got all the major players, except China, militarily in the Middle East, Russia, the United States, NATO countries, all the countries, and Iran, of course, being there, Israel being there, Saudi Arabia being there. And then you add that to the combustible toxic mix of the Middle East, and then you introduce climate change and heat and storms and how that affects technology that we rely on, our satellite technology, our missile technology, then famine. When you will always have one of the consequences of climate change will be instability in a society, in a culture. Well, you will have pandemic health arise when you have the seas flooding cities, raw sewage in cities. I mean, we got some of that in Washington, D.C. today because of the drain problems last week when the torrential rains. It flooded. So you'll have immense health problems. You'll have food problems. You can't produce food. And it's complete chaos. So all of that mixed in the most unstable region in the world, the Middle East, is a prescription for real disaster.
And to add to that, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has put enormous strain on all governments, in particular strain on vulnerable countries who don't have the governance resources to deal with that pandemic. COVID-19 has also exacerbated food scarcity as people can't go to work to try to grow food and get food. So the risk of instability because of climate change is a crisis on top of many other crises. Turning back inward, we have within the United States, we have a really interesting question about how the executive branch could or should be reorganized to address climate change. Do you think that it would be helpful to have a Department of Climate Action, for example, created similar to DHS, outside of the EPA, outside of the Department of Interior? Do you think a standalone department would be helpful in addressing climate change?
Well, if I was president, I'd be willing to look at that. I'm not an advocate of that now because we have, as you know, a number of agencies and departments who have resources and some responsibility. But maybe we should concentrate this issue, because it is so serious, in one agency or one department and bring it together. I'm not sure that would result in a department. Department of Homeland Security, as I think everybody knows, you know, Sam, we created that after 9/11. And I was in the Senate at the time, right in the middle of all of it. We rolled up 22 different departments and agencies into one department. Well, it's still not manageable. I mean, it's still a management problem. I'm not sure we did it right. I think we did need a Department of Homeland Security, but I'm not sure rolling up 22 different agencies, different cultures, different dynamics was the way to do that. But anyway, we've got what we've got, and we've got to make it work. So I'd be cautious about a new department, but if I was president, I would certainly institute, one of the first things I would do, a task force immediately assigned to look at this, to see how we can do it better, mainly trying to bring the resources that are scattered in different departments around our government under one roof, and then have one leadership group responsible only for this issue. Now, we've just talked the last hour, Sam, about all the different factors involved in climate change, where it touches society. It touches all of society in every human way, defense way, policy way, diplomacy way. So every department has got to have some responsibility. I mean, I don't think you can take that away from them, but you could concentrate it in one agency, one department, And I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I'd want to know if I was president, and I would put a task force together, assign that, give them no more than a year to come up with some recommendations.
You know, it's interesting. I am reminded that, and I don't know what the right answer is. Yours sounds like a very good one to me, having a concentrated, hopefully bipartisan task force to look at all elements of this and to come up with a suggestion on how to coordinate action going forward. But in my days at the White House, we did have a person at the NSC whose job it was to do what you're saying to a large degree, which is to look out across the US government and around the world and to see what's happening on climate change, and then to host meetings on how to address it. So perhaps at a minimum, having an empowered National Security Council, National Economic Council, person or persons assigned solely to this portfolio would be a step in the right direction. In addition to a task force, not only because a task force ostensibly could get some bipartisan voices involved. Separate from the government piece, we have a question about what individuals can do, what a civil defense could look like. Well, what can people outside of public service currently do to try to mitigate the impacts of climate change?
Well, there are a lot of little things that I think people dismiss. I mean, for example, recycling, plastics, bottles, paying attention to where you put your garbage. We're seeing the automobile industry now move more and more toward hybrid, toward electric. I mean, the Chinese are way ahead of us on all that. I mean, we're coming along. I mean, those are the kind of things that just regular citizens can do and look at. I'm not saying everybody needs to go out and buy a hybrid or a Tesla or something, but there are a lot of ways. There are a lot of ways to do this, and I think as much as anything else, a citizen's responsibility is to be aware. It is to be aware, and when you're making your decision on who you're going to vote for example, ask that person, whether it's a state legislature or governor, federal legislator, whatever. Where are you on this issue? What's your position? What do you think? That's one thing citizens should do and can do. And be aware of what's going on. Be aware of how serious this issue is and the consequences that could happen and will happen if we don't get serious about dealing with it. So, I mean, that's not an exhaustive inventory, but those are little things that I think everybody can do. And
everybody on a global scale does include countries like Russia. So as we widen the aperture to the global landscape again, what has been your experience working with Russia on this host of issues? When you were secretary, when you were in Congress, did Russia get it? And did they contribute to trying to mitigate climate change, or did they drag their feet because they in some way felt like this benefited them?
Well, I never saw any indication that Russia was that concerned with climate change or in their interest. Just the opposite. Russia is the largest producer of oil in the world. Their economy is a singular economy. I mean, it's oil and natural gas. And it's not in their interest, quite frankly, to see every year the erosion of the use of oil and coal and natural gas. People going to renewables, to hydro, to nuclear, and so on. They've never had a leadership position on this issue, never. It's never been an important one to them because it's just the opposite what they think is important. And that is you keep pumping that oil, selling that gas, and exporting it, because their economy is a basket case. And they have no system. I mean, after the implosion of the Soviet Union back in '91, there was great hope that maybe a new democracy developing in Russia could also develop a market economy where that would improve their standard of living and all that goes with a market economy. But that requires freedom. And of course, they have fallen right back into a new authoritarian way of life. And unfortunately, when you look at the future for Russia, it's not hopeful in that area. So no, Russia has never been involved, never been a leader. And again, I say, I think they viewed it mostly that it works against their own interests.
Because of their dependence on oil as an export, and with international sanctions already in place, that's an issue. And we'll see if any more are levied. My eyes are on whether Germany will make any decisions to step away from this Nord Stream 2 pipeline in light of the assassination of a Russian opposition figure. I'm not hugely optimistic on that front, but that'll be quite interesting. Russia certainly does have a vested interest in getting everyone to keep pumping oil, for sure. Last question for you is on the role of technology. And when you were secretary, how much did you work with technology companies on issues in general, and in particular on forming partnerships to try to address climate change?
Sam, one of the last things I did before I left the department in February of 2015, I made a speech at the Ronald Reagan Library in November of 2014 and announced a new process that I was implementing called the third way. And that was to move the Department of Defense, DARPA, our technologies, our research efforts more closely to the private sector, whether that's in Massachusetts or California or wherever it is, not just move closer to them to buy their end product, their platforms, but in the research capabilities and the initiatives and the invention and the creativity to take more advantage of the private sector so that we could integrate and strengthen the relationship. Yes, there are boundaries between the private sector and government and all that goes with it. I get that. But we could be doing a whole lot more than what we're doing now to really integrate into the private sector and get their knowledge and work with them in many ways for our own interests, their interests as well. And so what I had introduced in late 2014 called a third way was to come at it how we were going to go forward differently than what we had done. Defense Department, especially our DARPA, different agencies in the Defense Department have done a great job over the years. But what I was concerned about is that we were continuing to concentrate too much, although it's the purview of the Department of Defense, it's the charge of the Department of Defense, on only security weapon type technology. Cyber today, I think, is the greatest threat to our country out there. Yes, nuclear is out there and all the rest, but cyber is right there. Everybody's got it, and everybody's getting good at it. The Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and they're pinging our private sector all the time. They're pinging our government. I think there needs to be far more cooperation in all these areas of technology, cyber being one of them, between our Defense Department, also Homeland Security, all our agencies, and the private sector. Because I think the seriousness of the threat that cyber and everything that it represents to this country, whether it's elections, whether it's social media, anything, that cyber can change things. And it's so dangerous, and I will end with this, especially at a time when this country is so off balance, with such a lack of trust and confidence in its leaders and its institutions. when there's a breakdown in a democracy of confidence and trust in institutions and in those institutions, then we're going to be in trouble, because those governing institutions and our leaders who lead them, and I don't mean just government institutions, I mean the media, I mean every institution in this country, when there's a breakdown in confidence and trust, what's left? And you're seeing it play out in the streets today and in a lot of political activity. Well, we're going to go out and get armed because we don't know if the police can protect us, for example. I don't trust anything the media tells us. I don't trust anything that anybody says coming from government. I don't trust our leaders. I mean, a country is in trouble when that happens. Cyber, then the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, all of them take advantage of that. And they play into that, just like they've been doing in our elections. 2016, 16 independent intelligence agencies, as you know so well, Sam, have all said over the last few years, yes, the Russians played big time. And yes, they're playing even more significantly now in elections, as well as China and Iran.
Certainly, and Russia's intent, as described by the Director of National Intelligence in January 2017, was to undermine confidence in our democratic process. And as you just mentioned, through influence operations online, just retweeting certain people, retweeting conspiracy theories does undermine trust, as does a denial of science and a denial of intelligence. And I mean classified intelligence, but a denial of science and denial of intelligence makes it hard to know who to trust in positions of leadership right now. And I look forward to the day when that is back in place. And Mr. Secretary, I have a million more questions that I could ask you, and I wish that I could, but we're at the end of our conversation. And I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. I want to thank Perry Worldhouse and for having both of us on this critically important issue. And I'm going to turn things back to Michael, but huge thanks from me for doing this and for your continued championing of climate change as a national security issue.
Thank you very much, Sam, and to everyone involved, and especially all those who tuned in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Hagel, for those insights. And thank you, Sam, for moderating an exceptionally interesting conversation. And thanks to our audience for joining us here today and asking thoughtful questions. These are critical issues to our national and global security, and it's an honor to have you discussing them here at Perry Worldhouse. Thankfully, we have one more incredible keynote for our Global Shifts Colloquium. Unfortunately, we need to reschedule it. Patricia Espinoza, the leader of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, will speak with the New York Times' Lisa Friedman in the weeks ahead. That event was initially scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, but because of a scheduling conflict, it must be rescheduled. We apologize for any inconvenience. If you signed up for the event, you'll receive an email with the new time and date shortly. If you haven't signed up for the event, but you're on this event, you'll probably get an email too. Next week also brings Penn's Climate Week. We're excited to be hosting Sue Biniez, one of the lead negotiators of the Paris Climate Agreement from the US State Department, and a Perry Worldhouse Visiting Fellow this year on Monday to discuss the Paris Agreement 5 years later. Links to register for all of those events are in the chat, and a recording of this broadcast will be available on the Perry Worldhouse YouTube channel. If you want to get more information about Perry Worldhouse, please sign up for our mailing list, follow us on social media at Perry Worldhouse, and thank you for being here with us today. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.